The air in the grand ballroom smelled of expensive lilies and floor wax, a scent that usually made me feel like an outsider, but tonight it felt like a cage. My sister-in-law, Sabrina, laughed as she loudly announced to the entire table that I was only there to hold her purse and make sure the caterers didn't mess up the vegan options. She leaned over, her diamonds catching the light, and told me that being a homemaker was just a fancy word for someone who couldn't handle a real job in the family firm. I looked at my husband, David, expecting him to defend me, but he just sipped his wine and told me to stop being so sensitive because Sabrina was just joking. I felt the heavy weight of the digital recorder in my clutch, realizing that the man I loved was just as cold as the sister who looked down on me. My name is Maya, and I am 34 years old. For the last decade, I have been the quiet backbone of the Harrison family, managing a household that runs like a Swiss watch while David climbed the corporate ladder. To the world, I am the supportive wife who hosts the perfect dinners and remembers everyone's birthday. But to my in-laws, I am a placeholder, a woman without real ambition because I don't have a CEO title. Sabrina is the one they always praised, the favorite who inherited the sharp tongue and the family's aggressive business instincts. I wasn't rich or glamorous like Sabrina, and I didn't have a corner office in a skyscraper, but I had something they didn't expect: a digital footprint and a network of influence they never bothered to track. They thought I was just organizing the pantry, but I was actually organizing a revolution from the guest bedroom. If you've ever been treated like you're less than because you chose to stay home and build a life instead of a career, hit that subscribe button. I want to hear your story in the comments. Have you ever been the invisible glue holding a family together while they looked right through you? Let's go. Click hype or like if you're ready to see the tables turn. The evening took a sharper turn when the main course arrived. Sabrina stood up to give a toast, but instead of honoring the charity, she decided to humiliate me publicly. She told the crowd of 300 people that the Harrison family believed in excellence and contribution, which was why she was officially appointing David as the new chairman of the foundation, a role I had been unofficially running for 5 years without a single paycheck. She looked right at me and said that since I had so much free time now that the kids were in boarding school, I could finally focus on my little hobby of scrapbooking. The table erupted in polite laughter, but David's laugh was the loudest. I asked him later, in a quiet whisper, if he knew she was going to take the foundation away from me. He just shrugged and said it was a family legacy and that I wasn't technically a real Harrison. He told me I should be grateful I even got to attend the gala. But they didn't know what I was doing while I sat in the car waiting for the kids at soccer practice. They didn't know why I spent my leisure time at the public library or why I had a separate phone hidden in my gym bag. 7 years ago, I started a blog under a pseudonym, writing about the intersection of ethics and high finance. It turned into a newsletter, then a podcast, and eventually, it became a massive media platform that the elite in the city read every single morning. I am the anonymous auditor, the voice that has taken down 3 corrupt hedge fund managers in the last year alone. While Sabrina was busy posing for magazine covers, I was busy building a community of whistleblowers. They thought I was the one asking for permission to buy a new dress. But soon, they'd be the ones begging me not to publish the truth about where their excellence really came from. The betrayal deepened a few weeks later when I went to the bank to withdraw some of my personal savings for my mother's surgery. The teller looked at me with genuine pity and told me the account had been emptied. David had moved all the funds into a joint venture with Sabrina, claiming it was for a family investment that I wouldn't understand. When I confronted him, he didn't even apologize. He told me that since he earned the money, he had the right to decide how it was used. Then, at a neighborhood garden party, I overheard Sabrina telling the neighbors that I was going through a phase, and that my mental health was the reason I was no longer involved with the foundation. She was setting the stage to make me look unreliable, a classic move to ensure that if I ever tried to leave, I would look like the problem. I went home, sat in my dark kitchen, and realized the woman who used to cry was gone. I opened my hidden laptop and sent a single message to my lead investigator. "It's time. Open the Harrison file." I met with an old contact of my father's, a man named Marcus. No, wait, I mean Elias, an old family lawyer who had been pushed out by Sabrina years ago. Elias was the black sheep of the legal world because he actually had a conscience. He looked at the evidence I had gathered and whistled. He told me that David and Sabrina hadn't just been arrogant, they had been sloppy. They had been using the foundation's charity funds to pay off the interest on their failing real estate projects. It was a massive web of hypocrisy and illegal transfers. He told me that if we played this right, I wouldn't just be getting a divorce, I would be taking over the entire board. The tension began to build as the annual shareholders meeting approached. Sabrina and David were walking around with a sense of total victory, convinced they had finally managed me into total submission. They even asked me to help them prepare the slideshow for the meeting, thinking I was too broken to care. I smiled and agreed. I told them I would make sure the final reveal was something no one would ever forget. The days following the charity gala were some of the longest of my life. The house, which I had once filled with warmth and the scent of fresh lavender, now felt like a cold museum where I was merely a curator of my own misery. David didn't even hide his disdain anymore. He would come home late, smelling of expensive cigars and the perfume of women who clearly didn't spend their days folding laundry or helping kids with long division. He told me that my role in the family was functional, a word that stung more than any insult. He meant that I was a tool, like a dishwasher or a lawnmower. I was there to keep the gears turning so he and Sabrina could shine. I sat in the kitchen, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, feeling the silence of the children who had been sent away to boarding school under the guise of better opportunities. But I knew the truth. They were sent away, so I would have no allies left in the house. The betrayal shifted from emotional to financial with a speed that made my head spin. I discovered that David hadn't just moved our savings. He had taken out a secondary mortgage on our home to fund one of Sabrina's visionary tech startups. He hadn't even told me. I only found out when a notice from the bank arrived in the mail, addressed to the occupant. When I confronted him in his home office, he didn't even look up from his laptop. He told me that, as the primary earner, his signature was the only one that mattered in the eyes of the family legacy. He said I should focus on the guest list for the upcoming garden party and leave the big boy decisions to people who understood how to multiply wealth. I felt a cold shiver go down my spine, but it wasn't fear. It was the last spark of my old life dying out. I began to spend my afternoons at the local library, a place where I was just another face in the crowd. Under the flickering fluorescent lights, I worked on my anonymous success. My media platform, the Ledger of Truth, was gaining traction that I never dreamed possible. I was receiving leaks from insiders at the city's top firms, people who were tired of being stepped on by families like the Harrisons. I realized that Sabrina's excellence was built on a foundation of unpaid vendors and exploited employees. She had a reputation for being a girl boss, but the reality was much darker. She was a bully in a designer suit. I started documenting everything: the late payments, the forged signatures, the way she used the family foundation as a personal piggy bank to fund her lavish lifestyle. The humiliation continued at a neighborhood garden party a week later. Sabrina was holding court near the rose bushes, surrounded by the elite of our social circle. She saw me approaching with a tray of drinks, because the caterers were short-staffed, and she had asked me to help out as a favor. As I reached the group, she reached out and plucked a glass of champagne from the tray, but not before making a comment about my outfit. She told the group that I was vintage, which was her code for poor. She laughed and said that I was the only person she knew who still mended her own clothes. Then, she turned the conversation to my mental state again. She whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, that the stress of doing nothing was clearly taking a toll on my nerves. She said that David was considering a wellness retreat for me in the fall, a polite term for a psychiatric facility. I felt the eyes of the neighborhood women on me, pity, judgment, and relief that it wasn't them. I didn't drop the tray. I didn't scream. I just smiled and told her that a retreat sounded lovely, but I was currently very busy with a project of my own. She laughed, a sharp, metallic sound, and asked if I was finally finishing that scrapbook of the kids' baby teeth. The group erupted in laughter, and David just stood there, swirling his drink, a smug look of satisfaction on his face. He liked seeing me small. It made him feel bigger. But as I walked away, I felt the weight of the phone in my pocket. I had recorded the entire exchange. It wasn't just for my lawyer. It was for the world to see the true face of the prized child of the Harrison family. The tension in the house became unbearable as the annual shareholders meeting approached. This was the day when the family's financial health would be laid bare to the board, and Sabrina was desperate to show a profit. I noticed her and David huddling in the study late at night, their voices hushed and frantic. They were moving numbers around like a shell game, trying to hide the fact that their real estate ventures were bleeding cash. I knew exactly where the holes were, because I had been the one digging them up through my anonymous sources. I realized they were planning to use the children's trust funds as collateral for a final, desperate loan. That was the moment I stopped being a wife and became a whistleblower. I contacted Elias, the lawyer who had been waiting in the wings. We spent the night in his cramped, paper-filled office, going over the final pieces of damning evidence. He told me that what I had wasn't just enough for a divorce. It was enough to dismantle the entire Harrison empire. As I drove home in the early hours of the morning, the sun just beginning to peek over the horizon, I felt a strange sense of peace. The bitter, sad woman who had spent years trying to earn a seat at a table that didn't want her was finally gone. In her place was a woman who was about to flip the table over entirely. I walked into the house, the smell of old wood and expensive wax greeting me like a familiar enemy. I went to the guest bedroom, opened my laptop, and hit send on an encrypted file to the board of directors. The subject line read, "The True Cost of Excellence." I knew that by the time David and Sabrina woke up, their world would already be on fire, and I would be the only one with the extinguisher. The week leading up to the annual shareholders' meeting felt like living inside the eye of a hurricane. On the surface, everything in the Harrison mansion was eerily still. The marble floors were polished to a mirror shine, and the scent of fresh lilies, Sabrina's favorite, filled every hallway like a floral shroud. But beneath that perfection, I could hear the foundations cracking. David was rarely home, and when he was a ghost. He would pace the study, his footsteps heavy and uneven, while the low murmur of frantic phone calls bled through the heavy oak doors. He didn't look at me. He didn't even acknowledge the meals I placed in front of him. I was a piece of furniture he had forgotten to sell. I spent those days in a state of cold, sharp focus. The sadness that had weighed down my chest for a decade had finally hardened into a diamond-tipped spear. Every time I heard Sabrina's high-pitched, arrogant laugh through the phone, or watched David check his reflection with that smug, self-satisfied tilt of his chin, I reminded myself why I was doing this. I wasn't just fighting for my dignity, I was fighting for the children's future. They had already stolen my past, but I wouldn't let them gamble away the inheritance my father had intended for my kids. I sat in the library, the smell of old leather and dust grounding me, as I finalized the digital dossiers with Elias. We had every bank transfer, every forged memo, and every recorded insult categorized like a catalog of sins. The betrayal hit a new peak on Wednesday morning. I was in the laundry room, the rhythmic thumping of the dryer the only sound in the house, when I found a document tucked into the pocket of one of David's suit jackets. It was a draft for a new trust agreement. My heart stopped when I read the terms. He wasn't just moving the savings, he was attempting to have me declared legally incapacitated due to my supposed mental health struggles. The document outlined a plan to move all my remaining assets into a conservatorship controlled by Sabrina. They weren't just trying to divorce me, they were trying to erase my personhood. They wanted me locked away in a wellness retreat, while they spent the last of my father's money to save their failing reputation. I didn't cry. I didn't even tremble. I simply took a photo of the document, sent it to Elias, and put it back exactly where I found it. The coldness in my veins felt like ice water. I realized then that there was no family left to save. There was only a predator and its prey, and I was done being the prey. I went upstairs and dressed for the pre-meeting dinner, choosing a simple, dark navy dress that made me look invisible. That was my greatest strength. They had spent so many years training themselves not to see me that I could walk through their lives like a phantom, gathering every secret they dropped. The dinner was a small, intimate affair for the senior board members. Sabrina was in her element, wearing a red dress that looked like a warning sign. She sat at the head of the table, holding court about the bold new direction the Harrison Foundation would be taking under her leadership. She mentioned the failing real estate projects as a temporary hurdle that her visionary tech startup would soon clear. She didn't mention that the startup was a hollow shell with no actual product. When she looked at me, her eyes were full of a cruel, triumphant light. She asked me, in front of the chairman of the board, if I had packed my bags for my retreat yet. She said the fresh air would do wonders for my fragile mind. The chairman, A stern man named Mr. Abernathy looked at me with a mix of pity and discomfort. David just stared at his plate, refusing to catch my eye. I took a slow sip of water, feeling the cool liquid slide down my throat. I looked Sabrina directly in the eye and told her that my bags were indeed packed, but I wasn't sure I'd be the one leaving. The table went silent. Sabrina let out a jagged, mocking laugh and told the board that I was having one of my episodes. She apologized for my behavior and suggested I go upstairs to rest. I stood up, smoothed my dress, and apologized to Mr. Abernathy for the disruption. As I walked out, I saw David's hand shake as he reached for his wine. He knew something was wrong, but he was too arrogant to believe I could actually strike back. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the guest bedroom, watching the clock tick toward the morning of the meeting. The sound of the clock was the only thing louder than my own heartbeat. I felt like a soldier in the trenches, waiting for the whistle to blow. I thought about the anonymous auditor persona I had built. I thought about the thousands of people who read my words every day, people who believed in the truth. I wasn't a lonely housewife in a big, empty mansion. I was the leader of an invisible army. I looked at the photos of my children on the nightstand and promised them that by the time they came home from school, the world would be a very different place. The morning of the meeting arrived with a gray, drizzly sky. The bank's headquarters loomed over the city like a fortress of glass and steel. I drove myself, refusing David's offer to have the driver take me. I wanted to be in control of my own movement. I arrived early and met Elias in the lobby. He looked tired but sharp, his briefcase bulging with the physical evidence that would back up my digital leak. He told me that the board had received the encrypted file I sent the night before, and that the atmosphere inside was electric with panic. Sabrina and David had no idea. They arrived 20 minutes later, looking like a power couple on a magazine cover, smiling for the cameras they had hired to document their big day. As we walked into the boardroom, the air felt charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. The board members were already seated, their faces grim and unreadable. Sabrina took her place at the podium, ready to give the presentation of her life. She looked at me sitting in the back row and smirked, as if she were surprised I had even found the building. She started her speech, talking about legacy and trust, and the Harrison Standard. She was 5 minutes into her presentation when Mr. Abernathy stood up and interrupted her. He didn't ask about the tech startup. He asked about the $300,000 moved from the Children's Trust to a Cayman Islands account on Tuesday. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever heard. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a library. It was the suffocating, heavy silence that follows a sudden explosion. Sabrina froze, her hand still hovering over the remote for her polished slideshow. For a moment, she looked like a statue carved from ice. Then, her eyes darted to David, who had suddenly developed an intense interest in the grain of the mahogany table. She tried to laugh, but the sound that came out was thin and reedy. She told Mr. Abernathy that there must be a clerical error and that the family's private accountants handled those minor, internal transfers. She said it was part of a broader strategy to shield the children's future from market volatility. Mr. Abernathy didn't sit down. He didn't even blink. He reached into a folder in front of him and pulled out a high-resolution printout of the wire transfer. He noted that the clerical error featured Sabrina's personal digital signature and David's authorization code. He asked why the market volatility protection required the funds to be moved into an account linked to a defunct shell company in the Caymans, the same company currently being investigated by the Ledger of Truth. I sat in the back row, my hands folded neatly in my lap, feeling the vibration of the city's traffic through the floor. The smell of stale coffee and expensive stationery in the room felt sharper, more clinical than before. I watched David finally look up. His face was a map of terror, the smug mask he had worn for a decade finally melting away. He looked at me, and for the first time in years, he truly saw me. He didn't see the babysitter, or the homemaker, or the invisible woman. He saw the person who had handed the board the rope they were currently using to hang him. He tried to speak, but his voice was a dry croak. He told the board that he had been misled by his sister, and that he had only signed the documents because he trusted her business acumen. He was throwing her to the wolves in a desperate attempt to save his own skin. It was the ultimate betrayal, the kind that only happens when the prized child realizes the pedestal is crumbling. Sabrina's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide with a mix of fury and disbelief. She called him a coward and a liar, her voice echoing off the glass walls. She told the board that David was the one who had insisted on the transfers because he had gambled away their liquid assets on a failed real estate play in the suburbs. The power couple was tearing each other apart in front of the very people they had spent years trying to impress. It was a spectacular, public meltdown. I felt a cold, hard satisfaction blooming in my chest. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the truth finally being louder than their lies. The chairman turned his attention to me. He asked if I had any further documentation to provide, as the anonymous source who had sent the encrypted file had suggested I might be able to clarify the family's recent financial history. I stood up slowly, my heels clicking on the hardwood floor as I walked toward the front of the room. I didn't look at David's pleading eyes or Sabrina's venomous glare. I looked at the board. I opened my own folder and produced the recordings of the garden party, the copies of the secret trust agreement, and the evidence of the wellness retreat they had planned for me. I told them that the Harrisons weren't just mismanaging funds, they were actively conspiring to commit fraud against the board, the shareholders, and their own family. The tension in the room was so high I felt like the glass walls might actually shatter. Sabrina tried one last desperate move. She screamed that I was a scorned wife and that I had no legal standing in the company. She said I was mentally unstable and that my testimony shouldn't be trusted. But then, Elias stepped forward. He introduced himself as my legal counsel and the former head of the Harrison legal department. He informed the board that under the original charter my father had helped draft, I held a veto power over any major asset transfers involving the children's trusts, a power I had never been informed of, but one that remained legally binding. He told them that every move they had made in the last 6 months was not only a breach of contract, but a criminal act of embezzlement. I looked at Sabrina, who had sunk back into her chair, her red dress now looking like a stain on the professional decorum of the room. I told her that she was right about one thing. I was a homemaker. And as a homemaker, I knew exactly how to deal with trash when it started to rot the foundations of the house. I told her that the anonymous auditor was currently publishing the full story on every major financial news outlet in the city. The world would know by noon that the Harrison legacy was a hollow shell. David buried his face in his hands, realizing that the invisible woman had just ended his career, his reputation, and his freedom in a single, calculated move. The boardroom felt like a pressurized chamber where the oxygen was slowly being sucked out. David remained slumped in his chair, his expensive wool suit suddenly looking 3 sizes too big for his shrinking frame. Sabrina, however, wasn't going down without a final, desperate claw at the air. She stood up, her face twisted into a mask of pure venom, and pointed a shaking finger at me. She screamed that I was a parasite, a woman who had contributed nothing but laundry and carpools to the Harrison empire. She told the board that my evidence was stolen, that I had hacked into private servers, and that she would have me arrested before the sun went down. I didn't flinch, I didn't even blink. I stood there, feeling the cool draft from the air conditioning hit the back of my neck, and I let her scream. The sound of her voice, once so sharp and commanding, now sounded like the screeching of a bird caught in a trap. When she finally ran out of breath, the silence that followed was even more damning. Mr. Abernathy looked at her with a disgust so profound, it seemed to physically push her back into her seat. He told her that the board wasn't interested in her opinions on my marriage. He said they were interested in the $3 million that had evaporated from the employee pension fund, a fund that Sabrina personally managed. The blood drained from Sabrina's face until she was the color of the white lilies she loved so much. I stepped closer to the table, my voice low and steady. I told her that I hadn't hacked anything. I didn't need to. I told her that when she treated me like part of the furniture, she forgot that furniture has ears. I told her I had heard every late-night argument, every whispered deal, and every laugh at the expense of the people she was robbing. I had simply been the one to keep the receipts. I turned to David, who finally looked up at me, his eyes red and pleading. He tried to reach for my hand, whispering that we could still save the family, that we could go away together and start over. I looked at his hand, the same hand that had signed the papers to have me committed to a wellness retreat, and I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a clean, hollow space where my love for him used to live. I told him that the only thing he was going to start over was his life in a much smaller room with bars on the windows. I told him that I had already filed for an emergency injunction to freeze every single one of their personal accounts. The allowance they had been giving me was about to become the only money they had left to pay for their defense lawyers. Elias stepped forward then, his briefcase open, revealing the final blow. He handed a set of documents to the board's legal counsel. He explained that because of the way the Harrison Charter was written, the fraud committed by David and Sabrina triggered an automatic bad actor clause. This meant they were immediately stripped of their voting rights and their seats on the board. Furthermore, because I was the only remaining clean member of the family trust, the oversight of the entire foundation now fell to me. I wasn't just the whistleblower, I was now the boss. The transition in the room was instantaneous. The board members, who had spent years ignoring me at holiday parties, were suddenly standing up to offer me their chairs. They were looking at me with a newfound respect that bordered on fear. They saw a woman who had operated under their noses for 7 years without making a single mistake. I watched Sabrina's jaw drop as she realized that the scrapbooker had just executed a perfect corporate takeover. She tried to stand up to leave, but Mr. Abernathy told her to sit back down. He said the authorities were already in the building and that he suggested she wait for them there. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the city. The rain had stopped, and a pale, watery sun was trying to break through the clouds. I could see the news vans beginning to gather at the entrance of the building below. The anonymous auditor had delivered the scoop of the century, and the world was hungry for the details. I felt a strange sense of lightness, as if I were floating. The heavy, suffocating weight of being a Harrison wife had finally evaporated. I turned back to the room, looking at the wreckage of the 2 people who had tried to destroy me. I told them that I would see them in court, but for now, I had a business to run and children to bring home. The security guards entered the boardroom with a heavy, rhythmic thud of boots that seemed to signal the final heartbeat of the Harrison dynasty. I watched as they stood behind David and Sabrina, their presence making the room feel even smaller than it already was. Sabrina tried to pull her designer blazer tight around her, a pathetic attempt to gather the shreds of a dignity she had long ago traded for greed. David didn't even try to stand. He looked like a man who had finally realized that the shadow he had been stepping on for 10 years was actually the person holding up the floor. The sound of the handcuffs clicking was small, but it echoed like a gavel in the silence of the high-altitude office. I didn't stay to watch them being led out through the lobby where the cameras were waiting. I didn't need the satisfaction of seeing their faces plastered on the evening news. I had already seen the truth, and that was enough. I walked out of the boardroom and into the executive suite that used to belong to Sabrina. The room smelled of her expensive, suffocating perfume, so I walked straight to the windows and pushed them open. The cold, fresh air of the city rushed in, clearing out the scent of lies and old money. I sat down in the high-backed leather chair, feeling the weight of the mahogany desk beneath my palms. It didn't feel like power, it felt like peace. Mr. Abernathy walked in a few minutes later, his expression no longer cold or distant. He looked at me with a genuine, weary respect. He told me that the board had officially voted to appoint me as the interim chairperson of the foundation. He said they needed someone with unimpeachable ethics to navigate the coming storm, and apparently, I was the only person left in the building who fit the description. I told him that I wouldn't be doing it for the title or the prestige. I would be doing it to return the stolen pension funds to the employees, and to ensure the children's trust was locked away where no prized child could ever touch it again. He nodded, handed me the master keys to the digital vault, and left me alone with my thoughts. I took out my personal phone and made one call. It wasn't to a lawyer or a journalist. It was to the boarding school. I told the headmaster that my children would be coming home today and that I would be picking them up myself. The sound of my own voice felt different. It was no longer the quiet, hesitant whisper of a woman trying not to wake a sleeping giant. It was the voice of a woman who had slain the giant and taken his kingdom. I realized that for 10 years, I had been building a mountain out of the very stones they had thrown at me. I had used their insults as bricks and their neglect as the mortar that held my secret life together. I drove home one last time to the mansion, but I didn't go in through the servants' entrance. I parked right in the middle of the circular driveway and walked through the front doors. The house was quiet, the smell of floor wax and lilies finally starting to fade. I went to the guest bedroom and packed my laptop my journals, and the photos of my kids. I didn't want the furniture, the art, or the expensive clothes David had bought me to keep me quiet. I wanted the life I had built in the dark. As I walked back to my car, I saw the for sale sign being hammered into the lawn by a crew I had hired an hour ago. I wasn't going to live in a museum of my own misery. The sun was finally breaking through the clouds as I reached the school. I saw my kids running toward me, their faces lighting up with a joy that had been missing for too long. I hugged them both, feeling the solid, real weight of their presence. I told them that things were going to be different now, that we were going to live in a house with a garden they could actually play in, and that their mother was never going to be invisible again. They didn't need to know the details of the boardroom or the bank transfers. All they needed to know was that they were safe, and that the woman holding them was the strongest person they would ever know. They spent so much time looking down at me that they never noticed I was the one building the mountain they were standing on. They thought I was the one who needed an allowance, but I was the one who owned the bank. Now the mountain is mine, and the view from the top is finally clear. I looked back at the city skyline one last time before driving away. The Harrison name was a stain that the rain was finally washing away, and my own name, Maya, was the only one that mattered now. I wasn't just a survivor. I was the architect of my own freedom. Have you ever had a secret win that you kept from people who didn't believe in you? Share your story of quiet success in the comments below. Whether it's a side hustle, a degree, or just finding your worth, I want to celebrate with you. Click hype to help this story reach others who need it. This story is a reminder that your current situation is not your final destination. If you found power in Maya's journey, make sure to subscribe and join our community. We're all about rising above the noise and proving the doubters wrong. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.